My name is Camille Ashford. I'm 36 years old, and I examine property titles for a living. I've spent 11 years finding the buried problems in other people's paperwork, the liens nobody disclosed, the signatures nobody noticed were missing. I just never expected to find my own name missing from the deed to my dead husband's house. Welcome back to Betrayed Life, where quiet people finally stop staying silent. If stories about family, money, and the moment someone finally stops paying speak to you, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one ends with two women in handcuffs at a building dedication ceremony. And I was standing at the podium when it happened. My husband, Theo, died 4 years ago in a workplace accident at the manufacturing plant where he'd supervised the floor for 9 years, a fall from a loading platform that should never have happened, and that a wrongful death settlement eventually confirmed shouldn't have happened. The company's safety inspections falsified for months beforehand. The settlement, combined with his life insurance policy, came to just over $400,000. I used most of it to pay off our mortgage outright and finish the renovation Theo and I had been slowly working on for years. A house in Riverside Heights that had been in his family for 2 generations before we bought it from his aunt. The same house he'd grown up visiting every summer. Theo's mother, Patricia, never fully accepted that the house belonged to us rather than remaining, in some emotional sense, family property she still had claim over. She'd grown up in that house herself as a child, before her own mother sold it to Theo's aunt decades earlier. And something about watching her son and his wife own it outright, paid off completely, apparently sat wrong with her in ways she rarely said directly but often implied. It should have stayed easier to keep in the family, she told me once, shortly after the funeral, in a tone I mistook at the time for simple grief rather than the beginning of something else entirely. I worked title examination for a regional title insurance company, the department that verifies clean ownership before any property sale or refinance can close. It's careful, unglamorous work, reading deed histories, tracing chain of title back through decades of transfers, catching the small clerical problems that can unravel an entire sale if left unnoticed. I'm good at it. I've caught fraud for strangers more times than I can count over 11 years. I never once thought to check my own house's paperwork. Why would I? I lived there. I paid the property taxes myself every year from our joint account, an account that, after Theo's death, I never formally retitled into my name alone. Grief making that particular piece of paperwork feel unbearably small compared to everything else I was managing that year. The problem surfaced 18 months ago entirely by accident, the way these things usually do. I was refinancing a small rental property I'd purchased separately after Theo's death, using savings I'd built independently, and the title company handling that unrelated transaction ran a routine background check across my name, standard practice before any closing. It flagged an anomaly. A quitclaim deed filed on the Riverside Heights property, my home, 14 months after Theo's death, transferring ownership from Theodore and Camille Ashford, joint tenants, to Patricia Ashford, sole owner. I remember staring at that flagged notice on my own computer screen at work, in my own department, doing the exact job I do every single day for strangers, and feeling something go very cold and very still in my chest. I pulled the full recorded deed that afternoon using the same public records access I use professionally every day. There it was, a quitclaim deed, notarized, filed with the county recorder 14 months after my husband's death. My signature at the bottom beside a notary stamp certifying I'd appeared in person to sign away my ownership of the home I still lived in every single day. I do signature examination as a routine part of my job, comparing signatures against known exemplars to catch exactly this kind of forgery. I pulled 6 samples of my actual signature from my own employment file and compared them against the deed. The forger had gotten close. Not close enough. My real signature has a small distinctive break in the C where I lift my pen slightly before continuing. A habit from childhood penmanship lessons that's remained consistent my entire adult life. The forged signature on that deed had no break at all, a single continuous stroke, the mark of someone who'd studied my signature from old cards or documents, but never actually watched me write it in real time. I sat at my desk for a long time before I did anything else. The notary listed on the deed was a woman named Charisse Odom, someone I didn't recognize, whose license, a few minutes of searching revealed, was registered to an address that traced back to a mobile notary service my sister-in-law, Yolanda, Theo's younger sister, had used previously for her own small business filings. I built the timeline the way I build every file professionally, hour by hour, document by document. The quitclaim deed had been filed 14 months after Theo's death, Roughly the same period, I now remembered Patricia becoming suddenly, uncharacteristically insistent about handling some old paperwork from your aunt's estate that she said needed my signature. Paperwork she'd brought to the house one evening in a folder I'd signed without reading closely, exhausted from a full year of grief, work, and managing Theo's remaining affairs alone. I remembered signing something that night. I remembered nothing about what. I requested the full notarial journal entry associated with that deed filing. A public record, any Illinois notary is legally required to maintain and produce on request. The journal entry described the signing taking place at an address in Riverside, a coffee shop, on a date and time I could prove, through my own employer's badge swipe records, that I'd been at work in a meeting 11 miles away. I hadn't signed anything at a coffee shop. I'd signed a folder of papers at my own kitchen table, papers I now understood had likely been switched or layered, so that what I actually signed was buried somewhere beneath or replaced entirely by a document I never saw and never agreed to. I called my sister Denise, not Theo's family, my own sister, the person I trusted most in the world, and told her everything, sitting at my kitchen table with the county recorder's printout in front of me. She said the thing that finally made the whole picture click into place. "Cam, has anyone said anything to you about property taxes lately? Because Marcus mentioned at Thanksgiving that Yolanda's been telling people she's helping her mom manage the estate property since your renovation loan came through." I hadn't taken out a renovation loan. Theo and I had paid for the finished renovation entirely in cash from the settlement, specifically so we'd own the house free and clear. That sent me back to the recorder's office the following week, and there it was, filed 6 months after the fraudulent quitclaim deed, a home equity loan taken out against the property, $130,000, borrower listed as Patricia Ashford, sole owner, exactly as the forged deed now falsely established her to be. The money hadn't gone toward any renovation. I traced it the way I trace every suspicious transaction. Through the closing disbursement records, the lender was legally required to produce once I identified myself as a title professional, flagging a suspected fraud on a property I was the rightful, if now fraudulently dispossessed, owner of. $40,000 had gone to Yolanda directly, described in Patricia's own loan application notes as a family business investment, which turned out, with some further digging, to be a boutique consulting firm Yolanda had launched 8 months earlier that had, as far as I could determine, no actual clients. $55,000 had gone toward a down payment on a condo in Patricia's name in a nicer building than the one she'd been living in. The remaining $35,000 had simply been spent, credit card statements later showing travel, furniture, the ordinary accumulation of a woman quietly enjoying money she had no legal right to have borrowed against a house that wasn't hers. I want you to understand what discovering this actually cost me to sit with, because that's the part people skip past in stories like mine. I had spent 4 years grieving my husband in that house, painting the nursery we never got to use into a home office instead, keeping his tools organized exactly the way he'd left them in the garage because moving them felt like erasing him twice. And for over 2 years of that grief, his own mother had been quietly siphoning equity out of the walls around me, using a signature that wasn't mine, while accepting my sympathy cards, my Christmas gifts, my invitations to Sunday dinner. I confronted Patricia first, alone, the way I'd confront any subject before escalating a case professionally. I laid the deed on her kitchen table, the same kind of kitchen table where I'd apparently signed away my own home without knowing it. She didn't deny it the way I expected her to. She looked at the document for a long moment and said, with a calm that unsettled me more than anger would have, "That house was Ashford land before it was ever yours, Camille. I grew up in that house. You married into it. I was simply making sure it stayed protected the way family property should." "You forged my signature," I said. "You took out $130,000 against a house I live in using a name that isn't yours to sign." "I protected what my son would have wanted kept in the family," she said. "Yolanda needed help getting her business started. You have a good job, Camille. You were never going to struggle the way she has." Never once in that entire conversation did she use the word theft. Never once did she acknowledge that the house had been paid for with money that existed specifically because her son had died. I want you to know I offered her a way out first, the same as I'd offer any subject before a case escalated beyond recovery. I drafted a private settlement, the fraudulent deed voided, the equity loan assumed and repaid entirely by Patricia and Yolanda directly, no criminal report filed, my ownership simply quietly restored. I drove the papers to her new condo myself. She read the first page standing at her kitchen counter, exactly the way I imagined she'd once stood reading whatever document convinced her taking my home was justified. And then she set it down and said, "I won't be signing anything that makes it sound like I stole from my own family." "You did steal from your own family," I said. "You stole from me." "You're not family the way you think you are, Camille," she said. "You married in. Blood decides what stays protected." I left with the unsigned papers, and I understood, driving home, that there was no version of this that ended quietly. Filing the fraud report meant something specific for me professionally that most people wouldn't understand. Title fraud cases involving a licensed examiner's own property trigger an automatic ethics review at my company, a safeguard against exactly the kind of conflict of interest that could theoretically let someone in my position quietly fix their own paperwork improperly instead of reporting it. Filing meant weeks of scrutiny into my own conduct, while investigators confirmed I hadn't simply exploited my professional access to correct things off the books. Not filing meant living the rest of my life in a house legally, on paper, half owned by a woman who'd stolen it from me and felt no shame about it at all. I filed the formal fraud report with the county recorder's fraud unit and a parallel criminal complaint with the state's attorney's financial crimes division on a Wednesday morning. The deed forgery, the fraudulent notarization, the equity loan obtained under false ownership, documented and tabbed the way I'd document a case for anyone else. The investigation took 9 months. Charisse Odom, the notary facing her own license and potential felony exposure, cooperated once investigators connected her stamp to 2 other suspicious filings, eventually confirming she'd notarized the document based on Patricia's assurance that I'd already signed it and simply couldn't attend in person that day. A story Odom admitted she should never have accepted, but had, for a modest fee, chosen not to question. There was a building dedication that October, a small community center renovation project Patricia had spent months chairing and fundraising for through her church, her name prominently listed as lead organizer on the program, a plaque with her name already mounted near the entrance. Yolanda was there too, seated in the front row, having apparently used part of the stolen equity as a visible family sponsorship donation to the very project her mother was being honored for. I was invited, still absurdly, as Theo's widow, an invitation Patricia had apparently never thought to revoke, perhaps because revoking it would have required acknowledging why she might need to. I went. Aunt Renata, Theo's aunt, who'd always privately doubted Patricia's account of the estate paperwork, came with me and squeezed my hand as the ceremony began. Midway through Patricia's own remarks at the podium, 2 investigators from the state's attorney's financial crimes unit walked in through the community center's side entrance, quiet and unhurried, credentials already out. Patricia saw them mid-sentence, and for one visible moment, the composed warmth she'd worn her entire public life simply emptied out of her face. I didn't stand to make a scene. I didn't need to. The lead investigator said her name aloud, clearly, and then Yolanda's, and 40 guests who'd come to celebrate a woman's generosity watched instead as she was walked out past the plaque bearing her own name, her daughter following 2 steps behind her, the boutique consulting firm's phantom client list, apparently the last piece investigators had needed to fully connect Yolanda to knowingly benefiting from the fraud. Patricia pled guilty eventually to forgery and financial exploitation, receiving 18 months and a restitution order covering the full equity loan amount plus my legal costs. Yolanda, whose direct role was smaller but whose knowing acceptance of stolen funds was well documented, received probation and her own restitution obligation. Charisse Odom lost her notary commission permanently and paid a substantial fine. The house was fully restored to my name alone within a year, the fraudulent deed voided by court order, the equity loan satisfied through restitution rather than my own pocket. I still live there. I finished the office where the nursery would have been. I still keep Theo's tools organized in the garage exactly the way he left them, not because I can't move forward, but because some things you keep in place simply because they were his, regardless of who else once tried to decide what was theirs to take. I don't see Patricia's side of the family anymore, except Renata, who calls most Sundays now, an unexpected inheritance of her own kind. I think about what Patricia said to me that day at her kitchen table sometimes, that I married in, that blood decides what stays protected. I understand now that she was telling me something true about herself the entire time, just not about me. Blood had never protected anything in that family. It had simply decided quietly and for years who was allowed to be exploited without consequence. I finally made the numbers come out honest, the same as I would for any stranger's file. It only cost me the family I married into to get there, And some days sitting in a house that's finally fully mine, that still feels like the fair trade. If this reminded you to actually read what you're signing, even for people you trust completely, take it as your sign this week to check. Share this with someone still quietly paying for a family that never intended to pay her back. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.